Hey guys, tonight we begin with something truly sinister. A time of death carts, decay, and desperation. We're diving into what life was really like during the Black Death. Forget those romanticized tales of castles and courtly love Hollywood fed you. The brutal truth. You probably wouldn't survive a single hour. Before we begin, take a second to like the video and subscribe. But only if you actually enjoy this kind of historical misery. And drop a comment telling me what time it is and where you're watching from. It's always wild to see how many of you tune in from every corner of the globe. Now, turn the lights low, maybe switch on a fan for that perfect ambient hum, and settle in. Things are about to get a little infectious. Imagine this. You've just awakened in the year 1348. The good news? You're alive. The bad news? That's likely to be temporary. Very temporary. The Black Death has been sweeping through Europe like a demonic houseguest, and you've just been dropped into its favourite playground. Your eyes flutter open to a world that smells like desperation marinated in fear, with subtle notes of human waste and rotting. Well, everything. Your bed isn't memory foam. It's a lumpy sack stuffed with whatever plant material wasn't needed for eating. Straw, perhaps, or if you're particularly unfortunate, just a pile of rags that haven't been washed since the previous owner died on them. Which, considering the circumstances, was probably last week. The mattress beneath you rustles with activity that isn't yours. That's right. You're sharing your sleeping space with an entire ecosystem of insects, rodents, and microscopic horrors that would send a modern entomologist into fits of academic ecstasy. Your pillow, a folded tunic that smells like the armpit of history. Your blanket, a rough wool covering that scratches like a cat with a grudge and weighs as much as a small child due to accumulated grime, sweat, and substances best left unidentified. Church bells toll in the distance, not as a quaint reminder of medieval charm, but as a funeral knell that hasn't stopped ringing for months. It's the soundtrack of your new reality, a constant reminder that death isn't just nearby. It's practically your roommate. Your home is a single-room dwelling with walls that do little more than suggest the concept of separation from the outside world. The floor beneath your feet isn't tile or hardwood or even concrete. It's packed earth that turns to mud when it rains, which seeps through the gaps in your poorly constructed dwelling. The roof above leaks in 17 different places, none of which you can afford to fix. During storms, you simply rearrange your few possessions to dodge the indoor rainfall and pray the whole structure doesn't collapse. The air inside your home is a complex tapestry of odours. There's the lingering scent of last night's meagre supper, the musty embrace of perpetually damp textiles, the sharp tang of human bodies that haven't bathed in months, and underlying it all, a new smell. Something sickly, sweet and putrid that seems to be everywhere these days. It's the smell of plague, though you don't know that yet. To you, it's just another unpleasant addition to the aromatic assault that is everyday life. You stretch, and your body responds with a symphony of cracks and pains. You're 25, which in plague-era terms means you're approaching elderly status. Your joints ache from hard labour, poor nutrition, and the damp cold that seems to have taken permanent residence in your bones. Your teeth, those that remain, throb dully, a constant companion of discomfort you've learned to ignore. Privacy is a concept that won't be invented for several hundred more years. Your entire family, parents, siblings, perhaps a spouse and children, maybe even a cousin or two who had nowhere else to go, all sleep in this single room. Some on the bed platform, others on pallets on the floor. The youngest ones, wherever they happen to collapse from exhaustion the night before. Bodies everywhere, breathing, snoring, coughing, especially coughing these days. And this is just the first moment of your day. You haven't even gotten up yet. The real horrors are still waiting for you outside, where the streets are filling with corpses and the air itself seems to carry death on its breath. Welcome to the Black Plague era. Hope you didn't have any plans for next week, or tomorrow, or even this afternoon. Because in this world, making it to sunset counts as a major achievement. And you, my pampered modern friend, with your antibacterial soaps and expectations of basic hygiene, you wouldn't last until lunchtime. Morning hygiene in plague-era Europe. So you've managed to peel yourself off your bug-infested mattress. Congratulations on surviving the night, a feat that's becoming increasingly noteworthy as the plague tightens its grip on your community. Now it's time for your morning ablutions, a ritual that bears about as much resemblance to your modern bathroom routine as a wolf does to a chihuahua. Nature's call is particularly urgent this morning. Perhaps it was the questionable stew you consumed last night, or maybe it's just your body's desperate attempt to expel whatever might be brewing inside you. Either way, you need a toilet, and you need it now. Except there is no toilet, not as you understand it. No porcelain throne, no cushioned seat, no scented candle to mask unfortunate odours. In plague-era Europe, your bathroom options range from primitive to, dear God, why? If you're a rural peasant, your facilities consist of a hole in the ground behind your dwelling. It might have a rough wooden plank across it if you're particularly innovative, or perhaps a splintery seat if you're practically nobility. The smell emanating from this pit would make a modern sewage treatment worker faint. It's a potent blend of human waste, decomposition, and the special kind of fermentation that only occurs when bodily fluids meet open air for extended periods. Town dwellers have their own special version of bathroom hell. You might use a chamber pot, a ceramic vessel kept under the bed for nighttime necessities and emptied each morning. And where does one empty such a vessel? Why? Out the window into the street below, of course. The medieval waste disposal system can be summarized as throw it and forget it. The narrow streets between buildings serve as open sewers, channels of human and animal waste that turn into foul-smelling rivers when it rains. Some larger towns have public latrines, wooden structures built overflowing water or deep pits. These are less private restrooms and more community gathering spots where excretion happens to occur. Privacy screens? Unheard of. You'll be conducting your business shoulder to shoulder with strangers, perhaps engaging in conversation about the increasing number of plague victims while trying not to breathe too deeply. The smell of these public facilities can be detected from 3 streets away. It's a physical presence, a wall of stench that you walk through rather than past. Birds avoid flying over them. Dogs give them a wide berth. Only humans, with their peculiar social customs, willingly enter these miasmic chambers of horror. And toilet paper. That's a luxury awaiting invention several centuries in your future. Your wiping options include leaves, check carefully for irritating species, moss, nature's sponge, a handful of straw, exfoliation at its most medieval, or if you're wealthy, perhaps a scrap of wool cloth that's reused until it practically disintegrates. Most people simply use their left hand and a splash of water, which explains why eating with that hand is considered taboo. Speaking of water, perhaps you'd like to wash your hands after this unpleasant experience. Good luck with that. Water isn't something you waste on hand washing during a plague. It's carried from wells or rivers in heavy buckets, each drop precious for cooking and drinking. Besides, the prevailing medical wisdom suggests that washing might open your pores and invite disease in. That layer of grime on your skin, it's not dirt, it's protection. Your face doesn't fare much better in this morning routine. There's no refreshing splash of cool water, no minty toothpaste to banish morning breath. Your teeth, those blackened, rotting remnants still clinging to your gums, receive no attention whatsoever. The concept of dental hygiene won't be popularized for centuries. Your breath smells like something died in your mouth, which, considering the state of your gums, isn't far from the truth. Some people might rinse their mouth with vinegar or rub their teeth with a cloth, but most simply accept that oral pain is part of existence, like taxes or plague sores. Toothaches are handled by either ignoring them until they abscess, or visiting the local barber surgeon who will gladly extract the offending tooth with iron tools and zero anesthesia. The procedure is quick, excruciating, and frequently leads to infections that can kill you just as efficiently as the plague, though with more personalized attention. Hair care during the plague is similarly primitive. Combs exist, usually made of bone or wood, but they're primarily used for removing the larger parasites from your scalp. Lice are so common that they're practically considered normal body fauna. Everyone has them, from peasants to kings. The constant itching is just another sensory input in a world already overflowing with discomfort. Some people cover their hair with caps or cloths, not for fashion, but to contain the vermin and hide the greasy, matted mess beneath. Washing hair is a rare event, perhaps occurring a few times a year for the exceptionally hygienic. The process involves heated water, a luxury, harsh lye soap that burns the scalp, and hours of drying time during which you're vulnerable to catching a chill, potentially fatal in a world without antibiotics. And yet, amidst all this filth and discomfort, people are becoming increasingly concerned with cleanliness. Not because of evolving standards of hygiene, but because of the plague. Rumours spread that the disease lives in bad air, the miasma of death and decay that hangs over towns like a shroud. Some people carry posies or herbs to sniff, believing these scents might protect them from disease. Others burn aromatic woods in their homes, not realizing that the smoke irritates lungs already compromised by poor air quality and malnutrition. As you finish your morning routine, a generous term for this haphazard acknowledgement of bodily functions, you notice something troubling. The lymph nodes in your groin feel tender, slightly swollen. Probably nothing, you tell yourself. Just another mysterious body pain in a life full of unexplained discomforts. But deep down, in the part of your mind that still clings to self-preservation, a quiet alarm begins to sound. Because you've seen what happens next. You've watched neighbours discover similar swellings, buboes they're called, that grow to the size of eggs, turn black, and eventually burst in a release of putrid fluid that signals the final countdown of a life. You push the thought away. There's work to be done, food to find, survival to attempt. You can't afford to be sick, not now, not with this sickness. But the plague doesn't care about your schedule. It operates on its own timeline, and it's very, very patient. Now that you've completed your pitiful excuse for morning hygiene, it's time to get dressed. In the modern world, this might involve a relaxing ritual of choosing an outfit that expresses your personality, matches the weather, or adheres to the latest fashion. In plague-era Europe, getting dressed is more like preparing for battle against the elements, parasites, and the constant threat of looking too healthy and thus attracting the jealousy of your plague-ridden neighbours. Your wardrobe consists of exactly one outfit. Not one outfit for today, one outfit total. The concept of having different clothes for different days is a luxury so far beyond your reality that it might as well involve time travel and flying horses. Your single set of clothing serves you for all occasions. working, sleeping, socializing, being terrified of plague symptoms, and eventually being buried in. Let's start with your undergarments, assuming you're fortunate enough to have them. For men, this might be a linen shirt that hangs to mid-thigh, yellowed from sweat and stained with substances best left unidentified. Women might have a similar linen shift, equally discoloured and worn thin in places from years of wear. These garments haven't been washed in months, possibly years, because soap is expensive, water is labour-intensive to haul, and frankly, everyone smells so terrible that no one would notice the difference anyway. Over this dubious foundation, you layer your main clothing. For men, this means woolen breeches or hose that cling to your legs like a second skin, except less hygienic and more prone to harbouring fleas. Women don a kirtle or gown, shapeless and practical, designed less for aesthetic appeal and more for the vague concept of modesty and the practical need to carry things in its voluminous folds. The fabric of your clothing tells the story of your economic status. If you're a peasant, your garments are made of coarse wool or rough linen, hand-spun and woven with all the precision of a drunken spider. The texture resembles modern sandpaper, creating a constant friction against your skin that ranges from mild irritation to open sores. The colour is a non-committal brown, not because it was dyed that way, but because that's what happens when fabric accumulates years of dirt, sweat, and smoke from cooking fires. If you're slightly wealthier, perhaps a merchant or skilled tradesperson, your clothing might actually have been deliberately coloured using plant dyes. Blues from woad, yellows from weld, reds from madder root, these natural dyes produce muted, earthy tones that fade with each rare washing. The colours serve a dual purpose. They indicate your relative prosperity while simultaneously hiding the worst of the stains. The truly wealthy, nobles and successful merchants might wear silks, velvets and furs, dyed in rich colours and occasionally embellished with embroidery or trim. But even these luxurious garments aren't cleaned regularly. The difference is merely in the quality of the filth they accumulate and the potency of the perfumes used to mask the inevitable odours. Speaking of odours, your clothing smells like a historical reenactment gone horribly wrong. There's the base note of unwashed human body, layered with smoke from cooking fires, the musty scent of damp wool that never quite dries, hints of whatever you've spilled on yourself in recent weeks, and possibly the metallic tang of blood if you've been coughing, a common plague symptom that you're desperately trying to ignore. Your outfit is held together with crude stitching and hope. Buttons exist but are expensive, so most closures are managed with laces, ties, or simple pins. Holes and tears are patched repeatedly until the original fabric is more memory than material. Nothing is discarded until it literally falls apart, and even then, the scraps might be repurposed as patches for other garments or as bandages, an especially poor choice during a plague, but necessity rarely consults with medical wisdom. Footwear, if you're fortunate enough to have it, consists of simple leather shoes with thin soles that offer minimal protection from the elements and none from the filth in the streets. They're poorly fitted, causing blisters and corns that add to your collection of daily discomforts. Many peasants go barefoot most of the year, their feet calloused and blackened, often wounded from stepping on sharp objects hidden in the muck of daily life. Accessories are minimal and practical, a belt to hang essential tools or a small knife. Perhaps a pouch for carrying the few coins you might possess or small items needed throughout the day. Women might wear a simple cap or veil to cover their hair, not for religious modesty, but to hide the greasy, lice-ridden mess beneath. Men might don a hood or hat, equally useful for concealing unwashed hair and providing minimal protection from the elements. As the plague progresses, fashion takes a morbid turn. Those who can afford it begin wearing masks filled with herbs and spices, believing these will protect them from the bad air that supposedly carries the disease. These masks, with their long bird-like beaks stuffed with aromatic substances, transform their wearers into nightmarish figures that would not look out of place in a modern horror film. The herbs do nothing to prevent infection, but the masks might accidentally provide some barrier protection, a scientific principle completely unknown to medieval physicians. Getting dressed each morning is not a matter of choice or expression, but of habit and necessity. You don't select an outfit. You simply put on the same clothes you took off the night before, if you bothered to remove them at all. The weight of your garments, heavy with accumulated grime, serves as a constant reminder of your place in this world, bound to the earth, to labour, to the cycle of survival that grows more precarious with each new plague victim. And as you adjust your clothing, tugging at the worn fabric and scratching at the ever-present itch of insect bites, you notice something alarming. The swelling in your groin has grown overnight. It's now visibly distending the fabric of your breeches. You touch it gingerly, wincing at the pain. It's hot to the touch, tender, and undeniably present. You've seen this before, the telltale bubo of plague, marking its victims like a farmer brands livestock. But you can't afford to be sick. You can't afford to acknowledge what's happening. So you adjust your clothing to hide the swelling as best you can and prepare to face the day, wondering if it will be your last. Because in plague-era Europe, getting dressed isn't just about covering your body, it's about preparing for the possibility that these rags might become your shroud before the sun sets again. Breakfast and morning nutrition. During the plague. Now that you're dressed in your single outfit of questionable cleanliness, your stomach growls with a familiar emptiness. It's time for breakfast, though calling it that might be giving this morning ritual more dignity than it deserves. In plague-era Europe, the first meal of the day isn't so much a culinary experience as it is a desperate attempt to stave off starvation for a few more hours. You make your way to what passes for a kitchen in your humble dwelling. There's no refrigerator humming in the corner, no coffee maker gurgling with promise, and certainly no toaster ready to transform bread into a crispy morning delight. Instead, there's a hearth, a simple fire pit with perhaps a crude chimney if you're among the fortunate. More likely, it's just an open fire in the center of your home, filling the space with smoke that stings your eyes and coats your lungs with soot. The centerpiece of your breakfast, and lunch and dinner, is bread. Not the artisanal sourdough you might pick up at a modern bakery, but a dense, heavy loaf that could double as a weapon in a pinch. It's made from whatever grain was available and affordable, usually rye or barley rather than wheat, which is reserved for those with deeper pockets. The flour is coarse, often stretched with fillers like ground peas, acorns, or, in times of particular desperation, sawdust. This bread isn't just unappetizing, it's actively hostile to your digestive system. The grinding process for the flour introduces small stone fragments that gradually wear down your teeth. The grain itself might be contaminated with ergot, a fungus that causes hallucinations, convulsions, and gangrene. But you eat it anyway because the alternative is nothing at all. To accompany this culinary cornerstone, you might have a bowl of pottage, a thick, porridge-like stew that's been simmering in the same pot for days, possibly weeks. New ingredients are simply added to the old ones, creating a continuous meal that evolves over time like a living organism. Today's pottage might contain some dried peas, a few withered root vegetables, and perhaps some herbs gathered from the roadside. If you're exceptionally lucky, there might be a small piece of salt pork or a bone to add flavour, though the meat itself was consumed days ago. The texture of pottage resembles something between modern oatmeal and wet cement, with occasional surprises that crunch between your teeth. Could be a grain of sand, a small pebble, or, if you're particularly unfortunate, a weevil that didn't cook long enough to soften properly. The taste is best described as aggressively bland, with occasional notes of whatever has been sitting in the pot the longest. What about beverages? Surely you can wash down this unappetizing fare with something refreshing. Well, yes and no. Water is available, but drinking it is a gamble with odds firmly stacked against your intestinal well-being. Most water sources are contaminated with human waste, animal carcasses, or the runoff from tanneries and other industries that use toxic substances. Instead, you drink small beer, a weak, low-alcohol brew that's safer than water because the brewing process involves boiling, which kills some pathogens. It's not particularly tasty, with a thin, slightly sour flavour that does little to enhance your meal. But it probably won't kill you immediately, which is the best endorsement any food or drink can receive during the plague years. Children drink this beer too. There's no age restriction, no parental concern about alcohol consumption, when the alternative is dysentery or worse. A slightly tipsy 5-year-old seems like the preferable option. If you're wealthier, you might start your day with wine instead, though it bears little resemblance to the carefully crafted vintages of modern times. Medieval wine is rough, often sour, and frequently watered down. Its primary virtue is that it contains alcohol, which makes both the taste of the wine and the reality of plague-era existence slightly more bearable. Fresh fruit? In season only, and even then, it's a luxury. Vegetables? Whatever can be grown locally and only when in season. Meat? A rare treat for most, reserved for special occasions or the tables of the wealthy. Eggs might make an appearance if you keep chickens, but they're valuable protein and often saved for trading rather than eating. As you chew your way through this dismal breakfast, you can't help but notice that your appetite isn't what it usually is. The swelling in your groin has been joined by a headache that pounds behind your eyes like a blacksmith's hammer. You feel unusually warm despite the morning chill, and there's a strange metallic taste in your mouth that the small beer can't wash away. These are more plague symptoms, adding to the growing evidence that your days are numbered. But there's no time to dwell on such thoughts. The food, such as it is, must be consumed. Energy must be found for the day's labour. Survival, even temporary, demands that you ignore the warning signs your body is frantically signalling. You force down another spoonful of pottage, trying not to think about the strange, dark spots that have appeared on your hands overnight. They look like bruises, but you don't remember injuring yourself. They're spreading up your arms now, these patches of darkened skin. Another classic sign of the advancing disease. But what choice do you have? There's no sick leave in medieval Europe, no healthcare system to fall back on. You either work or you starve, assuming the plague doesn't claim you first. So you finish your meagre breakfast, ignoring the fever that's beginning to make your vision swim, and prepare to face a day that might very well be your last. Because in plague-era Europe, breakfast isn't the most important meal of the day. It might be your final one. With your stomach half filled with questionable sustenance, you step outside your dwelling to face the day. The morning air, which in healthier times might offer a refreshing respite from your smoky home, now carries an undercurrent of dread. It's not just the usual medieval bouquet of human waste, animal dung and unwashed bodies. There's something else. A sickly sweet odour that seems to hang in the air like an invisible fog, clinging to everything it touches. That smell is death. Not the occasional expected death that has always been part of life, but death on an industrial scale, efficient, relentless, and everywhere. As you make your way down what passes for a street, really just a muddy path between buildings, you notice the changes that have crept over your community in recent weeks. Houses that were once bustling with activity now stand silent, their doors marked with crosses. Windows that used to frame curious faces are shuttered tight, as if their occupants believe wooden planks might keep out a force that travels on the very air they breathe. The first person you encounter is your neighbour, Willem, a barrel maker whose workshop has been suspiciously quiet lately. He's outside his home, his face gaunt and eyes hollow with a combination of fear and exhaustion. His wife died 3 days ago, and now his youngest daughter is showing signs of the sickness. The telltale buboes, swollen lymph nodes that grow to the size of eggs, have appeared in her neck and armpits. "Good morning," you offer, maintaining a distance that would seem rude in normal times but now feels woefully inadequate. Willem nods but doesn't speak. What is there to say? You both know his daughter will likely be dead within days. You both know that he, having cared for his wife until the end, is probably infected as well. You both know that the swelling in your own groin marks you as one of the walking dead. Conversation seems pointless in the face of such certainty. Besides, talking requires energy, and you're finding that in short supply this morning as your fever climbs. Further down the street, you see the cart. It's become a regular feature of daily life, a simple wooden wagon pulled by a weary horse, piled high with bodies wrapped in whatever fabric could be spared. Sometimes there's no wrapping at all, just naked corpses stacked like cordwood, their skin mottled with the dark patches that give the Black Death its name. "Bring out your dead," calls the cart driver, his voice muffled by the cloth he keeps pressed over his nose and mouth. It's a futile gesture of protection, but who can blame him for trying? He's been tasked with collecting the plague victims, a job no one wanted, but someone had to do. His payment is a few coins, and the desperate hope that constant exposure might somehow grant immunity. It won't. A door opens across the way, and a man emerges dragging something heavy. It's wrapped in a blanket, but the shape is unmistakably human. A small hand has escaped the covering, dangling lifelessly as the bundle is hauled toward the cart. A child, the latest victim. The father's face is a mask of grief so profound it's almost beyond expression. He hands over a coin to the cart driver, a payment for the removal service that has become as routine as buying bread. The driver takes it without comment, adds the small body to his grim collection, and moves on. The father stands in the street for a moment, staring at nothing, before turning back to his home where, you know from the gossip that still manages to circulate, his wife and 2 other children are also showing symptoms. You continue your walk, passing the church where a line has formed, not for confession or mass, but for last rites. The priest, looking haggard and terrified, moves from person to person, offering abbreviated blessings. He no longer takes the time to hear individual confessions. There are too many dying, too quickly. Instead, he offers blanket absolution, a spiritual efficiency born of necessity. The priest himself doesn't look well. His face is flushed, his movements sluggish. You wonder if he'll be among those needing rites rather than giving them by tomorrow. The thought should be shocking, but you've become numb to such possibilities. Death has become so commonplace that its approach no longer registers as extraordinary. Near the town well, a group of women have gathered to collect water. In normal times, this would be an opportunity for socializing, for exchanging news and gossip. Now they maintain careful distance from one another, their conversations brief and practical. One woman coughs into her sleeve, and the others subtly increase the space between them, a choreography of fear that has become instinctive. You notice that several familiar faces are missing from this morning gathering. The baker's wife, who usually dominates these conversations with her booming voice and strong opinions, hasn't been seen for days. The tanner's daughter, who recently married the blacksmith's son in a rare celebration that momentarily lifted the town's spirits, is now confined to her new home with suspicious symptoms. The old widow who lives near the edge of town, who survived 3 husbands and countless hardships, finally met an enemy she couldn't outlast. As you pass the town square, you see something that stops you cold. A group of flagellants has arrived, religious zealots who believe the plague is divine punishment for humanity's sins. They move through the square in a procession of pain, whipping their bare backs until blood flows freely down their skin. Their chants rise in the morning air, prayers and pleas for mercy mingling with the crack of their whips and the collective gasp of their self-inflicted suffering. Townspeople watch from a distance, some with hope that this extreme penance might turn God's wrath away from their community, others with the desperate fascination of those who have run out of rational solutions. You know it won't help. Other towns that hosted flagellants died just as quickly as those that didn't, but you understand the appeal of doing something, anything, in the face of unstoppable calamity. A sharp pain in your groin reminds you of your own precarious situation. The bubo is growing larger, more painful by the hour. You've been trying to ignore the fever, the headache, the strange dark patches appearing on your skin, but they're becoming impossible to dismiss. You're sick. You have the plague. And in this time and place, that's essentially a death sentence. You should go home, lie down, wait for the inevitable. But there's food to find, water to collect, perhaps some small tasks that might make your final days slightly less miserable. So you press on, each step a little less steady than the last, each breath a little more laboured. Because in plague-era Europe, the first signs of illness aren't just symptoms. They're a countdown clock, ticking away the hours of your remaining life with merciless precision. Now that you've witnessed the first signs of plague in your community, let's talk about what you're actually facing. The Black Death isn't just another illness, it's the medieval equivalent of an apocalypse, just with fewer zombies and more painful swellings in uncomfortable places. The disease that's currently turning Europe into one massive graveyard goes by many names. Some call it the Great Mortality, others the Pestilence. Physicians with their limited understanding might refer to it as a miasmatic imbalance of humours, which is medieval medicine's way of saying, we have absolutely no idea what's happening, but we'll charge you for the diagnosis anyway. Today, we know it as bubonic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. But you, poor medieval soul, have no concept of bacteria, no understanding of infection vectors, and certainly no access to antibiotics. What you do have is fear. Bone-deep primal fear that makes your already miserable existence even more wretched. The plague arrived in Europe like an unwelcome house guest, who not only refuses to leave, but also insists on redecorating your home with corpses. It likely originated in Asia, travelling along trade routes carried by fleas that hitched rides on rats. These rats, being the opportunistic survivors they are, stowed away on merchant ships, bringing death to each port they visited. By the time anyone realised what was happening, it was far too late. The symptoms begin innocuously enough: a headache, fever, perhaps some fatigue. In plague-era Europe, these could describe any Tuesday. You might dismiss them as the result of your perpetually poor diet, the constant physical labour, or just the general misery of medieval existence. But then come the buboes, swollen lymph nodes that grow primarily in the neck, armpits, and groin. These aren't subtle bumps, they're painful, obvious protrusions that can grow to the size of apples, turning purple or black as they fill with infection. These buboes are what give bubonic plague its name, and they're as attractive as they sound. Imagine having a grapefruit-sized, excruciatingly painful lump in your armpit. Now imagine it's turning black, hot to the touch, and possibly about to burst open and release a foul-smelling discharge. Appetizing, isn't it? This is your reality now. As the disease progresses, those distinctive black patches appear on your skin, hence the black in Black Death. These aren't like modern bruises that you might get from bumping into furniture. They're patches of dying tissue, areas where blood vessels beneath the skin have hemorrhaged. They start small, but spread rapidly, a visible map of the destruction happening inside your body. The final stages are particularly undignified. Vomiting, diarrhea, the coughing up of blood, delirium, and eventually merciful unconsciousness, followed by death. The entire process, from first symptom to final breath, typically takes less than a week. Some particularly unfortunate victims succumb in just 2 to 3 days. The mortality rate, somewhere between 30% and 90%, depending on the form of plague and the population affected. Those are odds that would make even the most reckless gambler think twice. And there's no treatment, no cure, not even palliative care beyond perhaps a sip of ale to dull the pain, or a priest to murmur prayers over your sweat-soaked form. Speaking of forms, bubonic plague isn't the only version making the rounds in your medieval nightmare. There's also pneumonic plague, which affects the lungs and can be transmitted directly from person to person through airborne droplets. This variant is even more deadly, with mortality rates approaching 100%. Victims cough blood, struggle for breath, and typically die within 24 hours of showing symptoms. Then there's septicemic plague, where the infection goes straight to the bloodstream. This form is so efficient at killing that victims sometimes die before buboes even have time to form. One moment they're complaining of a headache, the next they're dead, their skin already turning the telltale black from internal hemorrhaging. The speed and virulence of the plague create a particular kind of horror. People who seem healthy at breakfast might be dead by dinner. Entire families vanish in days. Villages become ghost towns in weeks. The scale of death is so vast that it defies comprehension, even for those living through it. And the medical understanding, practically non-existent. The prevailing theory involves bad air, or miasma, the belief that disease spreads through foul vapours emitted by rotting matter. Some physicians suggest that the alignment of planets is to blame. Others point to divine punishment for humanity's sins. A few even suggest that Jews are poisoning wells, leading to horrific pogroms that add human cruelty to nature's indifference. No one suspects the actual culprits, fleas carrying bacteria, transported by rats that thrive in the filthy conditions of medieval settlements. The concept of germ theory is centuries away. Microscopes haven't been invented. The idea that tiny, invisible organisms could bring down civilizations would seem like far-fetched sorcery to the medieval mind. This ignorance shapes every response to the plague, all of them ineffective. People carry posies of herbs to ward off miasma. They burn aromatic woods in their homes. They avoid bathing, even more than usual, to keep pores closed against bad air. Some towns ring bells constantly, believing the vibrations will disperse the poisonous vapours. Others ban the entry of strangers or goods from affected areas, one of the few measures that might actually help, though implemented for entirely wrong reasons. Physicians, those learned men with their impressive robes and air of authority, are worse than useless. Their treatments include bloodletting, because clearly what a body fighting massive infection needs is less blood. Applying herbal poultices to buboes, occasionally helpful for pain, useless for the disease. And prescribing theriac, a complex mixture containing dozens of ingredients, sometimes including opium, viper flesh, and ground-up mummy parts. Yes, actual mummies. Medieval medicine was nothing if not creative in its ineffectiveness. Some doctors recommend drinking your own urine. Others suggest sitting in sewers to acclimate the body to bad smells, thereby building resistance to the miasma. A few advocate for the application of a freshly killed pigeon, split open and placed on buboes while still warm. The birds are in for a rough time, and patients don't fare much better. The most iconic image of the plague era, the beaked doctor, won't actually appear until later outbreaks. These physicians wear bird-like masks with long beaks filled with herbs, spices, and dried flowers, believing these will protect them from miasmatic vapours. The full costume includes a waxed leather overcoat, gloves, and a hat, creating an ensemble that would look right at home in a nightmare. Ironically, this outfit might have provided some actual protection by preventing flea bites, but not for the reasons they thought. As the plague ravages your community, social structures begin to collapse. The dead outnumber the living. There aren't enough healthy people to dig graves, so bodies pile up in streets or are dumped in mass pits. Religious services are abandoned or severely abbreviated. Markets close. Fields lie untended. The basic functions of society, food production, waste management, law enforcement, falter and fail. In some places, the response is to turn inward, to isolate and protect what remains. In others, people abandon all restraint, indulging in whatever pleasures they can find before death claims them. Boccaccio's Decameron, written during the plague years, describes both extremes. Some thought that moderate living and the avoidance of all superfluity would preserve them from the epidemic. Others maintained free living was a better defense and would satisfy all cravings, drinking and singing, going about and gratifying the appetite in every possible way. Neither approach makes much difference to the plague. It kills the ascetic and the hedonist with equal efficiency. And you, with your growing buboes and spreading black patches. Your fate is sealed. Modern antibiotics could save you, but they're about 600 years in the future. All you can do is wait, suffer, and hope that whatever comes after death is better than what you're experiencing now. Because in Plague-era Europe, the reality of the Black Death isn't just that it kills you, it's that it kills everything. Individuals, families, communities, and the very fabric of society itself. Now that you understand the grim reality of the Black Death, let's explore what daily life actually looks like when society is collapsing around you. Spoiler alert, it's not exactly a medieval vacation. Social distancing in the 14th century isn't a carefully calculated 6 feet of separation with colourful floor markers and cheerful reminders to wash your hands. It's villages barricading their roads against travellers, families abandoning infected members, and the wealthy fleeing to isolated country estates, while the poor remain trapped in disease-ridden towns. Some communities attempt organised responses to the plague. Milan, for instance, takes the radical step of walling up houses where infection is found, essentially condemning everyone inside, sick and healthy alike, to death by disease or starvation. It's extreme, but somewhat effective. Venice establishes the first quarantine, holding ships in harbour for 40 days before allowing crews to disembark. The word quarantine itself comes from 40 giorni, Italian for 40 days. But these are exceptions. Most places have no coherent strategy beyond prayer, panic, and piling bodies in carts. Your own community has devolved into a patchwork of fear-based behaviours. Some households seal themselves away, refusing contact with anyone outside their immediate family. Food is left at doorsteps in exchange for coins soaked in vinegar, a primitive attempt at disinfection based on the correct observation that something about vinegar seems to help, even if no one understands why. Others take the opposite approach, abandoning all caution. If death is inevitable, why suffer the additional misery of isolation? These individuals continue to gather, to trade, to socialize. They visit the sick, comfort the dying, bury the dead. Their mortality rates are predictably higher, but their final days contain more human connection than those who die alone behind barred doors. Religious services become battlegrounds of competing priorities. The Church insists that Mass must continue, that the sacraments must be administered, that proper Christian burial is essential for salvation. Public health, though not conceptualized in those terms, suggests that gatherings spread disease and handling corpses increases risk. The compromise, if it can be called that, is abbreviated services, mass graves blessed hastily from a distance, and priests who move from deathbed to deathbed until they inevitably become patients themselves. Food acquisition during the plague takes on a desperate quality. Markets, when they operate at all, are subdued affairs with minimal interaction. Vendors and customers maintain distance, place coins in vinegar, or leave them in the sun, believed to purify objects somehow, and complete transactions as quickly as possible. Many stalls stand empty as their proprietors succumb to disease or flee. Agricultural production falters as field workers die or abandon their posts. Harvests rot unharvested. Livestock wander untended, some starving in barns when their caretakers die, others breaking free to roam until they're claimed by opportunistic survivors. The resulting food shortages compound the misery of plague-stricken communities. You find yourself constantly calculating risk versus necessity. Is your hunger great enough to justify a trip to the market? Is your thirst severe enough to risk drawing water from the communal well where others gather? Every interaction, every excursion becomes a potential death sentence, yet complete isolation means certain starvation. Family dynamics transform under the pressure of constant mortality. Parents face impossible choices: care for sick children and likely contract the disease themselves, or abandon them to die alone. Children watch parents succumb, then face a world without protection or guidance. Siblings turn on each other over inheritance when parents die, or band together with newfound intensity, the only survivors of once larger families. The emotional toll is incalculable. Grief becomes so commonplace that it loses its edge, transforming into a dull background ache rather than an acute pain. You stop counting the dead when the numbers become too great to track. You stop attending funerals when they occur hourly. You stop learning names of new neighbours because they'll likely be gone within weeks. Community breakdown accelerates as key members die. The blacksmith who maintained essential tools, the miller who ground grain, the midwife who delivered babies. When these individuals succumb, their specialised knowledge and skills disappear with them. Apprentices die before mastering trades. Oral traditions are interrupted when elders perish before passing on their wisdom. Law enforcement, such as it exists in medieval times, deteriorates rapidly. In some places, no one remains to maintain order. In others, harsh measures are implemented to prevent looting or to enforce quarantines. Property crimes increase as the desperate steal to survive. Violent crimes may actually decrease simply because there are fewer people alive to commit them, and those who survive are too weak or too focused on basic survival to engage in complex criminal enterprises. Religious responses to the plague vary widely, but share a common theme of inadequacy. Prayers go unanswered. Processions of penitents seem to spread disease rather than divine mercy. Indulgences purchased to reduce time in purgatory feel hollow when death is so immediate and visceral. Some cling more tightly to faith, seeing the plague as a test or punishment that must be endured. Others abandon religion entirely, unable to reconcile a loving God with the horrors they witness daily. Superstitions flourish in this environment of fear and limited understanding. People wear amulets, recite charms, avoid certain activities on particular days. Some believe that loud noises drive away plague, leading to the constant ringing of church bells or the firing of cannons in some towns. Others become convinced that specific foods or behaviors either attract or repel disease. These beliefs spread almost as rapidly as the plague itself, transmitted through the same human networks that carry the actual contagion. As days pass, your own symptoms worsen. The buboes are now excruciatingly painful, your fever rages, and the black patches spread across your skin like spilled ink. Movement becomes difficult. Breathing grows laboured. You find yourself confined to your dwelling, too weak to venture out, dependent on whatever kindness might prompt neighbours to leave food or water at your door. Most don't. They have their own suffering to manage, their own families to protect. Isolation in illness was the norm even before plague. Now it's practically guaranteed. The lucky might have family members willing to risk infection to provide care. The unlucky die alone, their bodies discovered days later when the smell becomes impossible to ignore. You drift in and out of consciousness, time losing meaning as fever dreams blend with waking nightmares. The sounds of your community continue outside, cartwheels on cobblestones, occasional voices, the persistent tolling of church bells marking yet more deaths. These sounds grow fainter as your hearing dulls, your body shutting down non-essential functions as it wages its losing battle against infection. In lucid moments, you might reflect on your life, so different from what you imagined as a child. You never expected to die young, though statistically it was always likely. You never expected to die of plague, though once it arrived, death became almost inevitable. You never expected to die alone, though in this new reality, solitary death is the common experience. Because in plague-era Europe, daily life during a pandemic isn't about living, it's about choosing how to die, and hoping that someone remembers to bury you afterward. Now that you're firmly in the grip of the plague, let's discuss your medical options. Spoiler alert, they're all terrible. And they all involve either pain, superstition, or substances you'd normally avoid touching with a 10-foot pole. Medieval medicine exists at that special intersection where ignorance meets confidence, creating treatments that range from merely useless to actively harmful. The medical understanding of the era is based on the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, which must remain in perfect balance for health. Any disease, including plague, is believed to result from an imbalance that must be corrected through various interventions, none of which address the actual bacterial infection ravaging your body. Your first encounter with medieval healthcare might be with a physician, assuming you can afford one and any remain alive in your area. These learned men, and they are almost exclusively men, have studied at universities, read ancient Greek and Arabic medical texts, and possess an unshakable confidence in theories that are spectacularly wrong. The physician arrives at your bedside wearing his professional robes, projecting an air of authority that would be more impressive if his last dozen patients hadn't died exactly as he predicted they wouldn't. He doesn't touch you. That would be beneath his dignity. Instead, he observes from a distance, perhaps asking an assistant to handle the distasteful business of physical examination. His diagnostic process begins with examining your urine held up in a glass flask against the light. The color, opacity, smell, and sometimes even taste, yes, really, informs his assessment of your humoral imbalance. He might also check your pulse, not to count heartbeats as modern doctors do, but to assess its quality. Is it strong or weak, regular or erratic? These observations, combined with astrological considerations and the specific appearance of your plague symptoms, lead to his diagnosis. And what is that diagnosis? If you're lucky, something like pestilential fever caused by an excess of black bile, exacerbated by an unfortunate conjunction of Saturn and Mars. If you're unlucky, he might blame your lifestyle, your moral failings, or the position of your bed in relation to the prevailing winds. Either way, the prognosis is grim, though he might couch it in terms vague enough to preserve his reputation when you inevitably die. The prescribed treatments are where medieval medicine truly shines in its creative awfulness. Bloodletting is almost certainly the first recommendation. The physician or his assistant will open a vein, usually in your arm, and drain a substantial amount of your blood into a bowl. The quantity removed would shock modern medical professionals, sometimes up to 30% of total blood volume. This at a time when your body desperately needs all its resources to fight infection. The theory behind bloodletting is that it removes excess or bad blood, restoring humoral balance. In reality, it weakens you further, accelerating your decline. But the momentary lightheadedness and altered consciousness following significant blood loss might be interpreted as improvement, reinforcing the practice's perceived effectiveness. If bloodletting doesn't cure you, and it won't, the physician might escalate to cupping or leeches. Cupping involves heating glass cups and placing them on your skin, creating suction as they cool. This draws blood to the surface, creating circular bruises that are somehow supposed to draw out bad humours. Leeches accomplish similar goals more directly by attaching to your skin and drinking your blood. They're particularly favoured for reducing the swelling of buboes, though they're as likely to spread infection as to provide any relief. Purgatives and emetics form another category of plague treatment. The logic is straightforward if flawed. If disease comes from within, expelling your body's contents should help. Powerful laxatives made from herbs like senna or more dangerous substances like mercury compounds will purge your bowels. Emetics induce vomiting, sometimes violently enough to cause internal damage. The resulting dehydration and electrolyte imbalances further compromise your already struggling system. For the plague's signature buboes, direct interventions are common. Lancing these swollen lymph nodes might occasionally provide pain relief as pressure is reduced, but without sterile technique or antibiotics. It introduces new infection pathways. Various poultices are applied to buboes, mixtures of herbs, animal dung, mould from bread, or toxic minerals like arsenic and mercury. These concoctions, plastered onto broken skin, create a perfect environment for secondary infections. Theriac, a complex preparation containing dozens of ingredients, is the medieval equivalent of a miracle drug. Originally created as an antidote to poison, it's repurposed for plague treatment. A typical theriac might contain herbs, spices, ground precious stones, animal parts, including viper flesh, opium and honey. Some formulations include mummy powder, literally ground up ancient Egyptian mummies imported at great expense. The effectiveness of theriac varies from 0 to slightly above 0, with any benefits likely coming from its opium content, which at least makes you too sedated to care that you're dying. Aromatics play a major role in plague treatment, based on the miasma theory that bad smells transmit disease. Sweet-smelling herbs like rosemary, lavender, and sage are carried in pouches, burned in homes, or rubbed directly on the body. The famous pocket full of posies from the children's rhyme Ring Around the Rosy refers to these herbal bundles. While they make the sick room smell marginally better, they do nothing to address the actual disease. Religious and magical treatments exist alongside medical ones, with the boundaries between them often blurred. Prayers, pilgrimages, undertaken by proxy if you're too ill to travel, and donations to the church are prescribed as earnestly as any physical remedy. Saints associated with plague protection, particularly Saint Sebastian and Saint Roch, are invoked constantly. Amulets inscribed with prayers or magical formulas are worn around the neck. None of these approaches improves survival rates, but they might provide psychological comfort in your final days. Pain management, a central concern of modern medicine, is an afterthought in medieval treatment. Opium, when available, provides effective relief but is expensive and often reserved for the wealthy. Alcohol serves as a more accessible alternative, though its effectiveness is limited. Various herbal preparations, willow bark, containing salicylates related to aspirin, henbane or mandrake, offer some analgesic properties, but come with their own risks and side effects. Most plague victims simply endure pain that would merit immediate and aggressive intervention in a modern hospital. The role of barber surgeons during plague outbreaks is particularly grim. These practitioners, who combine haircutting with surgical procedures, handle the physical interventions that physicians consider beneath their dignity. They perform bloodletting, lance buboes, amputate blackened limbs affected by septicemic plague, and generally serve as the hands-on counterparts to the more theoretical physicians. Their tools are crude, their antiseptic practices non-existent, and their training informal at best, but they're often the only option for direct intervention. As your condition deteriorates, medical attention becomes increasingly sporadic. Physicians and barber surgeons, overwhelmed by cases and concerned for their own safety, make brief visits at best. Family members, if they haven't abandoned you or succumbed themselves, provide what care they can with limited knowledge and resources. This might include changing sweat-soaked bedding, offering sips of water or broth, applying cool cloths to your fever-heated skin, or simply sitting with you as death approaches. In the final stages, medical treatment gives way to spiritual preparation. A priest might be called, though many clergy have died or fled. Last rites, if you receive them, are abbreviated and performed from a distance. The focus shifts from saving your life to saving your soul, an acknowledgement that medieval medicine has reached its very limited end. The cruel irony is that some plague victims do recover, not because of these treatments, but despite them. Natural immunity or less virulent strains of the disease occasionally allow survival, creating the dangerous impression that whatever remedy was last attempted must have worked. These rare recoveries perpetuate ineffective or harmful practices as desperate people grasp at any apparent success, and you, lying in your sweat-soaked bed with blackened buboes and spreading necrotic patches. The treatments you receive will not save you, They will add new dimensions of suffering to your plague experience, introduce additional infections, and potentially hasten your end. The kindest medical intervention would be simple comfort measures and pain relief. But these are rarely prioritized in a medical system more concerned with humoral theory than patient experience. Because in plague-era Europe, medicine isn't about healing. It's about applying theory so confidently that neither practitioner nor patient dwells too long on their consistent failure. Now that we've explored the medical horrors awaiting plague victims, let's zoom out and examine how the Black Death reshapes society itself. Because nothing transforms social structures quite like watching a third of the population die in screaming agony. The plague doesn't just kill individuals, it kills entire social systems. The carefully structured hierarchy of medieval Europe, with its rigid class distinctions and predetermined life paths, begins to crack under the pressure of mass mortality. Death, it turns out, is the great equalizer, though it still plays favourites based on wealth and geography. Class differences in plague survival become immediately apparent. The nobility and wealthy merchants have options that peasants can only dream of. When plague appears in a region, the rich simply leave. They retreat to isolated country estates, bringing sufficient supplies to wait out the worst of the outbreak. They travel in closed carriages, minimizing contact with potentially infected commoners. They maintain better baseline nutrition and health, giving their bodies more resources to fight infection if exposed. This exodus of the wealthy creates its own problems. Towns lose leadership and economic activity precisely when they need it most. The abandoned poor, seeing their supposed betters flee, develop resentments that simmer beneath the surface, occasionally erupting into violence or social unrest. The implicit social contract, protection in exchange for labour and taxes, feels broken when those in power prioritize their own survival so blatantly. For those wealthy enough to survive but not wealthy enough to escape, the plague offers a grim form of social mobility. As noble families die out, their properties and titles need new owners. Merchants who survive might find themselves elevated to nobility, filling vacancies in the social hierarchy. Younger sons, previously destined for the church or military due to inheritance customs, suddenly become heirs when their older brothers succumb. The plague reshuffles the social deck, creating opportunities amid catastrophe. The economic impact of the plague is seismic. The sudden reduction in population, particularly working-age labourers, creates a labour shortage that transforms the relationship between workers and employers. For the first time in generations, peasants and urban workers have leverage. They can demand higher wages, better conditions, and greater freedoms. Some refuse to work unless their terms are met, knowing that replacement workers aren't readily available. This newfound worker power terrifies the ruling classes. In England, the Ordinance of Labourers, 1349, and later the Statute of Labourers, 1351, attempt to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and prohibit workers from seeking better opportunities. Similar legislation appears across Europe. These efforts to maintain the old economic order ultimately fail as the demographic reality of fewer workers cannot be legislated away. The plague's economic impact extends beyond labour relations. Trade networks collapse as merchants die or refuse to travel. Luxury goods become scarce, while practical items, particularly those related to burial or medical care, see demand skyrocket. Prices fluctuate wildly. Inflation takes hold in some sectors, deflation in others. The relatively stable medieval economy, with its guild-regulated prices and production, gives way to something more chaotic and potentially exploitative. Property values plummet in plague-affected areas, creating opportunities for survivors to accumulate wealth through real estate. Agricultural land, suddenly abundant relative to the population needed to work it, decreases in value. Urban properties, abandoned by dead owners and their heirs, can be acquired for fractions of their pre-plague worth. This redistribution of property creates new wealthy classes, while further disadvantaging those without capital to invest. Religious upheaval follows close behind economic transformation. The Church, which had positioned itself as the intermediary between humanity and God, struggles to explain or address the plague. Prayers go unanswered. Processions of penitents seem to spread disease rather than divine mercy. Clergy die at rates similar to the general population, suggesting their special relationship with the divine offers no protection. This apparent failure of religious institutions plants seeds of doubt that will eventually flower into broader questioning of church authority. While immediate reactions might include increased piety and religious donations from survivors, partly out of genuine faith, partly from guilt at having survived, the longer-term trend moves towards skepticism. The Protestant Reformation, still centuries away, finds fertile ground in the collective memory of the Church's inadequacy during humanity's darkest hour. Scapegoating becomes a predictable but tragic response to incomprehensible suffering. Human nature demands explanations and targets for blame. Jews, already marginalized in medieval Christian society, become primary scapegoats, accused of poisoning wells or spreading disease through mysterious rituals. Pogroms erupt across Europe, with entire Jewish communities massacred or expelled. These persecutions occur despite Pope Clement VI issuing bulls condemning them and pointing out that Jews were dying of plague at the same rates as Christians. Other marginalized groups face similar persecution. Lepers, the disabled, foreign merchants, and women accused of witchcraft all experience increased hostility. The plague's psychological toll manifests as a need to blame someone, anyone, for the calamity, and those with the least social protection make convenient targets. Inheritance and property complications create legal nightmares that persist for generations. When entire families die, who inherits? When a husband, wife, and children all perish within days of each other, in what order did they die, and how does that affect the passage of property? Medieval legal systems, already cumbersome, buckle under the weight of these questions. Distant relatives emerge to claim abandoned properties. Forged wills appear. Disputes over inheritance lead to violence or decades-long litigation. The plague's impact on marriage patterns reveals its deep social consequences. With so many dead, survivors find themselves in a transformed marriage market. Widows and widowers, suddenly single again, remarry quickly, often to partners they wouldn't have considered before the population decline. Young people, seeing the fragility of life, marry earlier and have children sooner. The age gap between spouses often increases as older survivors seek younger partners to rebuild families decimated by disease. Family structures evolve in response to plague mortality. Extended families contract as older generations are wiped out. Orphaned children are absorbed into surviving households, creating blended families bound by necessity rather than blood. Sibling relationships take on new importance when parents die, with older siblings assuming parental responsibilities. These adaptations create family forms that diverge from the pre-plague norm, establishing new patterns that persist for generations. Community governance transforms when traditional authority figures die. Villages and towns develop new leadership structures, sometimes more democratic, sometimes more authoritarian, depending on local conditions and personalities. The plague creates a natural experiment in governance, with communities forced to rebuild their social organization from whatever human resources remain. Art and literature reflect the plague's psychological impact. The danse macabre, or dance of death, becomes a common artistic motif, depicting people of all social classes dancing with personified death, a reminder of mortality's universality. Memento mori, remember that you will die, emerges as a philosophical and artistic theme. Literature becomes preoccupied with questions of divine justice, human suffering, and the apparent randomness of survival or death. As you lie dying of plague, these broader social transformations might seem irrelevant. Your immediate concerns are pain, fear, and the looming certainty of death. But you are part of a historical inflection point, a moment when one social order collapses and another begins to form from its remains. Your death, multiplied millions of times across Europe, creates the conditions for a new world to emerge, one with different power structures, economic systems, and philosophical outlooks. The plague you're experiencing will eventually recede, leaving a transformed continent in its wake. Survivors will rebuild, adapting to new realities and opportunities. The rigid feudal system will gradually give way to more flexible social arrangements. Labor will gain value relative to land. The church's authority will face new challenges. These changes won't be immediate or universal, but the trajectory is set, and you won't live to see any of it. Your contribution to this new world is simply to die, becoming one more statistic in the great mortality that reshapes European society. It's not the legacy you might have chosen, but it's the one the plague has assigned you. Because in plague-era Europe, social consequences aren't abstract historical concepts. They're the direct result of millions of individual tragedies, including yours. Now that we've examined how the plague reshapes society, let's delve into its most intimate impact. What happens inside your mind when the world is literally dying around you? Because nothing tests mental health quite like watching your neighbours burst with buboes while wondering if you're next. Medieval people didn't have the vocabulary of modern psychology. No PTSD, no anxiety disorders, no clinical depression. But they experienced the full spectrum of psychological responses to trauma, just without the convenient labels and complete lack of effective treatments. The medieval understanding of mental health blended medical, religious, and supernatural explanations, creating a confusing landscape where your psychological suffering might be attributed to humoral imbalance, divine punishment, or demonic influence, sometimes all three simultaneously. Fear becomes the dominant emotional state during plague outbreaks. Not the brief adrenaline-spiking fear of immediate danger, but a chronic, grinding fear that settles into your bones and becomes a constant companion. You fear every interaction, every symptom, every stranger. You fear for yourself, your family, your community. This persistent state of alarm takes a physiological toll, weakening immune systems already challenged by poor nutrition and sanitation. A cruel feedback loop where fear of plague makes you more vulnerable to it. Grief transforms from an acute emotional response to a background condition of existence. In normal times, death is an occasional visitor marked by ritual and community support. During the plague, death becomes so commonplace that traditional mourning practices collapse under the sheer volume of loss. Mass graves replace individual burials. Funeral services are abbreviated or abandoned entirely. The psychological closure provided by proper mourning rituals disappears, leaving survivors with unprocessed grief that accumulates like sediment in a riverbed. The medieval response to this grief takes various forms. Some turn to religion with renewed fervour, finding comfort in the promise of heavenly reunion with lost loved ones. Others embrace fatalism, a psychological surrender that paradoxically provides relief by abandoning hope. Still others seek oblivion through whatever means available: alcohol, risk-taking behaviour, or the mindless routine of daily survival tasks that temporarily distract from emotional pain. Mass hysteria emerges as a collective psychological response to incomprehensible suffering. The dancing manias reported during and after plague outbreaks, where groups of people dance uncontrollably until they collapse from exhaustion, represent one manifestation of this phenomenon. These bizarre episodes, documented across Europe, suggest a population under such extreme psychological pressure that normal behavioral constraints dissolve. Flagellant movements represent another form of collective psychological response. Groups of penitents travel from town to town, publicly whipping themselves bloody to atone for humanity's sins and appease divine wrath. These displays of extreme self-punishment attract followers and spectators, creating a contagious form of religious expression that spreads alongside the physical disease. The psychological relief of action, any action in the face of helplessness, drives participation, even when that action involves self-harm. Children's experiences during plague outbreaks are particularly heartbreaking. Their developing minds lack the contextual understanding to process the chaos around them. They witness parents, siblings, and friends sicken and die without comprehending why. Many become orphans, forced to fend for themselves or rely on the charity of already strained communities. The psychological impact of such early trauma shapes their development, creating generations marked by loss and instability. These plague-era children develop coping mechanisms that might appear strange to modern observers. Some become precociously self-sufficient, taking on adult responsibilities at ages when modern children would be starting elementary school. Others regress, clinging to whatever stability remains, or withdrawing into fantasy worlds where the plague doesn't exist. Many develop a relationship with death that seems morbid by modern standards, a familiarity and acceptance that comes from constant exposure. Survivors' guilt emerges as a common psychological burden. Why did you survive when so many others died? Was it random chance, divine selection, or some quality within yourself? These questions haunt survivors, particularly those who watched family members die while they remained healthy. The guilt can manifest as self-destructive behavior, excessive religious devotion, or a driving need to justify one's survival through service or achievement. The psychological impact extends to basic trust and social cohesion. Communities that once functioned through mutual aid and shared responsibility fragment under the pressure of survival. Neighbours who previously helped each other through hardship now avoid contact, fearing contagion. Promises are broken when the promise maker dies unexpectedly. The basic predictability that allows social trust to develop disappears, replaced by a wary self-reliance that persists long after the immediate crisis passes. Sleep disturbances become nearly universal. Nightmares populated by images of disease and death interrupt what little rest you might find. Insomnia keeps you staring into the darkness, listening to the sounds of suffering from nearby homes, or jumping at every bodily sensation that might indicate infection. Sleep deprivation further compromises immune function and cognitive ability, creating yet another vicious cycle that increases vulnerability. Cognitive changes occur even among those who show no other symptoms of plague. Concentration becomes difficult when surrounded by death. Memory falters under the strain of constant vigilance. Decision-making abilities deteriorate when every choice feels potentially fatal. These cognitive impacts affect everything from daily tasks to community governance, compounding the plague's direct effects with a fog of psychological impairment that slows response and recovery. Religious faith undergoes profound testing. The medieval worldview centers on divine order and purpose, but the plague's apparent randomness challenges these fundamental assumptions. Why do the pious die alongside sinners? Why do prayers go unanswered? Why does God allow such suffering? These questions don't necessarily destroy faith. Many find deeper spiritual connection through suffering, but they transform it, creating more complex and nuanced religious understandings that influence theological development for centuries. For some, the psychological impact manifests as a carpe diem philosophy. Seize the day, for tomorrow we may die. This attitude appears in contemporary accounts of plague-time behavior, with survivors indulging appetites and desires previously constrained by social convention or religious teaching. Sexual promiscuity, excessive drinking, lavish spending on luxuries. These behaviors increase among certain segments of the population, representing both a psychological escape and a defiant assertion of life amid overwhelming death. Others respond with the opposite impulse, embracing asceticism and self-denial. If the plague represents divine punishment for human sin, perhaps extreme virtue might offer protection. This response drives some to monasteries and convents, others to hermetic isolation, and still others to rigid moral codes practiced within their communities. The psychological comfort of control, the belief that right behavior might ensure survival, motivates these choices, even when evidence suggests that saints die as readily as sinners. The concept of trauma, while not articulated in medieval terms, leaves its mark on survivors. What modern psychologists would recognize as post-traumatic stress manifests in heightened startle responses, emotional numbing, intrusive memories, and avoidance behaviors. These symptoms persist long after plague outbreaks subside, affecting survivors' ability to return to normal functioning and influencing their relationships with others who didn't share the experience. Community rituals develop to address collective psychological needs. Annual commemorations of plague outbreaks, special masses for the dead, and the establishment of shrines or monuments provide structured opportunities to process grief and honor losses. These rituals serve psychological functions similar to modern grief counseling, offering socially sanctioned spaces for emotional expression and remembrance. The psychological legacy of plague extends far beyond the immediate outbreak. Survivors carry their experiences into future generations through changed parenting practices, altered risk assessments, and narratives that shape community identity. Children raised by plague survivors inherit not just property and physical traits, but psychological patterns, heightened vigilance, specific fears, approaches to mortality that influence their own development and relationships. As you lie in your plague-stricken state, these broader psychological impacts might seem abstract. Your immediate experience is dominated by physical suffering, fear of imminent death, and perhaps regret for things undone or unsaid. But you are part of a collective psychological transformation that will reshape how Europeans understand themselves, their relationships to each other, and their place in the cosmos. The plague you're experiencing will eventually recede, leaving survivors to rebuild not just their communities, but their inner lives. The psychological adaptations developed during this crisis, some healthy, many not, will become incorporated into cultural practices, artistic expressions, and social norms. The plague doesn't just kill bodies, it transforms minds, creating new ways of thinking that persist long after the disease itself has temporarily retreated. And you, in your final feverish thoughts, contribute to this psychological legacy. Your fears, your courage, your despair, your hope. These responses, multiplied across millions of victims and survivors, collectively reshape the medieval psyche in ways that will echo through centuries of European development. Because in plague-era Europe, psychological impact isn't just individual trauma, it's the transformation of an entire civilization's relationship with mortality, meaning, and the human condition itself. Environmental factors. Now that we've explored the psychological devastation of the plague, let's turn our attention to the environment where this biological nightmare unfolds. Because where you live during the Black Death might determine whether you die screaming today or manage to postpone the inevitable until next Tuesday. The plague experience varies dramatically between urban and rural settings, each offering its own special flavor of medieval misery. Cities and towns, with their concentrated populations and non-existent sanitation, become perfect incubators for disease. The narrow streets, often no wider than a modern hallway, force constant close contact between residents. Houses lean toward each other across these claustrophobic passages, blocking sunlight and creating damp, shadowy conditions where disease thrives. The smell alone would knock a modern person unconscious. A potent blend of human waste, rotting food, tannery chemicals, and the sweet putrid odour of unburied corpses. Urban water sources quickly become contaminated as the dead and dying increase. Wells and public fountains, already questionable before the plague, turn deadly as bodies are disposed of improperly or desperate citizens wash infected clothing in communal water. Rivers flowing through towns, serving as both water source and waste disposal system, carry disease downstream, creating a hydrological network of contagion that connects communities in shared suffering. The density of urban rodent populations accelerates plague transmission. Rats thrive in medieval cities, feasting on garbage heaps and nesting in the thatched roofs and wattle and daub walls of typical dwellings. These rats host the fleas that carry Yersinia pestis, creating a mobile disease delivery system that scurries through homes and markets with impunity. When rats themselves begin dying from plague, their fleas seek new hosts, often humans, further accelerating transmission. Rural areas offer slightly better odds of survival, though better in this context means you might witness your entire family die before joining them instead of expiring simultaneously. The dispersed nature of agricultural settlements creates natural quarantine conditions. Isolated farmsteads might avoid infection entirely if they're lucky, or at least limit exposure compared to their urban counterparts. However, rural areas face their own challenges. Medical care, already inadequate in cities, is virtually non-existent in the countryside. Folk remedies and superstitions substitute for even the limited knowledge available to urban physicians. When plague strikes a rural household, victims often face their illness without any treatment whatsoever, not even the dubious interventions available to town dwellers. Food security becomes a critical issue in rural areas as agricultural labour is decimated. Fields go unharvested when farmers die or flee. Livestock wander untended, either starving in barns or breaking free to become feral. The resulting food shortages compound the direct effects of plague, creating secondary mortality from malnutrition that particularly affects children and the elderly. Weather and seasonal patterns significantly influence plague transmission and severity. The disease seems to thrive in moderate temperatures, spreading most rapidly in spring and autumn. Summer heat temporarily suppresses some outbreaks, while winter cold slows flea activity and reduces transmission. These seasonal fluctuations create a rhythm to plague outbreaks, with communities experiencing waves of infection that ebb and flow with the changing seasons. This seasonality offers brief respites, but also false hope. A summer decline in new cases might be interpreted as the end of an outbreak, leading to relaxed precautions and resumed normal activities, only for autumn to bring a resurgence more devastating than the initial wave. These cycles of hope and renewed despair take a psychological toll beyond the direct effects of disease, creating a population perpetually suspended between relief and terror. Climate conditions during the 14th century may have contributed to the plague's severity. The period marks the beginning of what historians call the Little Ice Age, a cooling trend that affected agricultural productivity and possibly rodent behavior. Poor harvests weakened population resistance through malnutrition, while changing weather patterns may have driven rodent populations into closer contact with humans as they sought food and shelter. The relationship between humans and animals takes on deadly significance during plague outbreaks. Domestic animals, particularly cats and dogs, might carry plague-infected fleas into homes. Livestock can harbour the disease. Even the presence of certain birds becomes ominous, as ravens and crows gather in unprecedented numbers, attracted by the abundance of corpses. Yet the most dangerous animal interaction involves the humble rat and its parasitic passengers. Black rats, Rattus rattus, also called roof rats or ship rats, thrive in human settlements, nesting in walls and roofs while feeding on stored grains and waste. These rats host the oriental rat flea, Xenocilla chiopes, which transmits Yersinia pestis between rodents and, when rat populations decline due to plague, seeks human hosts instead. This rat-flea-human transmission cycle remains completely unknown to medieval populations. No one makes the connection between rodent infestations and human disease. Cats, which might help control rat populations, are sometimes killed during plague outbreaks due to superstitious associations with witchcraft and the devil, inadvertently removing a natural check on the very animals spreading the disease. Sanitation, or more accurately its complete absence, creates ideal conditions for plague transmission. Human waste disposal consists primarily of throwing excrement into streets or cesspits that leach into groundwater. Food scraps and other organic garbage accumulate in corners and alleys, attracting rats and other vermin. Butchers slaughter animals directly in urban areas, discarding unwanted parts in nearby ditches or rivers. The concept of public health doesn't exist in any recognizable form. No authority coordinates waste management, water protection, or disease response. Individual households handle their waste according to convenience rather than any hygienic principle. The resulting environmental contamination creates perfect conditions for disease vectors to multiply and thrive. Building practices contribute to plague vulnerability. Typical medieval dwellings, constructed of wood, wattle and daub, or stone depending on region and wealth, offer ample nesting opportunities for rats. Thatched roofs provide ideal rodent habitat, while gaps in walls and foundations allow free movement between human living spaces and the outside world. Even stone buildings often have wooden upper stories and roofs where rats establish colonies. The interior arrangement of these buildings maximizes disease transmission opportunities. Multiple family members share not just rooms, but often beds, ensuring close contact that facilitates the spread of pneumonic plague. Limited ventilation traps respiratory droplets inside. Dirt floors absorb spilled bodily fluids and resist cleaning, creating reservoirs of contamination that persist long after visible traces disappear. Urban planning, such as it exists in medieval Europe, inadvertently promotes disease spread. Cities grow organically rather than through deliberate design, resulting in chaotic layouts with poor circulation and drainage. Streets follow ancient pathways, narrowing and widening unpredictably. Buildings encroach on public spaces over time, further restricting airflow and light. The resulting urban environment traps miasmatic vapors, according to medieval understanding, while actually concentrating disease vectors and limiting sanitary options. The landscape itself changes as plague decimates populations. Fields return to wilderness when there aren't enough survivors to maintain cultivation. Forests encroach on abandoned settlements. Wildlife returns to areas where human presence has diminished. These changes aren't immediately apparent during the acute phase of an outbreak, but become increasingly visible as months and years pass without population recovery. Mass graves alter local topography, creating subtle depressions that later generations will build upon, unknowing. These burial sites, often located just outside town walls or in repurposed churchyards, become part of the physical legacy of plague. Some are marked and remembered, others are forgotten until future construction projects unearth them, creating new health hazards centuries after the original outbreak. The environmental impact of plague extends to economic landscapes as well. Trade routes shift to avoid heavily affected areas. Certain industries, particularly those requiring concentrated labor like textile production, collapse in some regions while growing in others less affected by disease. These changes reshape patterns of resource use, urbanization, and land management for generations. As you lie dying of plague, these environmental factors form the backdrop to your personal tragedy. The rat that carried the flea that infected you remains hidden in your walls, perhaps already hosting a new generation of parasites ready to find their next victim. The contaminated water you drank, the waste-filled streets you walked, the crowded conditions you lived in, all contributed to your current state. Your death will soon become part of this environmental cycle. Your body, wrapped hastily in whatever cloth can be spared, will join others in a mass grave, or perhaps be burned if authorities have reached that level of desperation. Your home will stand empty until claimed by relatives or appropriated by survivors. Your possessions will be burned as potentially contaminated or redistributed among the living, possibly carrying plague with them to new households. The plague you're experiencing will eventually recede, leaving an altered landscape in both literal and figurative senses. Populations will slowly rebuild, adapting to new environmental realities. Agricultural patterns will shift to accommodate fewer workers. Urban areas will contract before eventually expanding again. The relationship between humans and their environment will evolve, incorporating hard-won knowledge about disease, even without understanding its actual mechanisms. And you, in your final moments of awareness, are simply one more element in this vast environmental transformation, a brief, suffering participant in a biological drama that reshapes continents while extinguishing individual lives with indifferent efficiency. Because in Plague-era Europe, environmental factors aren't just context, They're active participants in the dance of death that claims millions while transforming the physical world for centuries to come. Let's assume, against all odds and historical probability, that you've somehow survived the Black Death. Perhaps you possess some genetic resistance, or maybe you were one of the lucky few who lived in sufficient isolation to avoid exposure. Whatever the reason, you've emerged on the other side of this apocalyptic event, blinking in the strange new light of a post-plague world. Congratulations, your prize is a completely transformed society that you barely recognize. The first thing you notice is the eerie emptiness. Streets that once bustled with activity now echo with absence. Markets that overflowed with goods and humanity stand half empty, with fewer vendors selling to fewer customers. Churches that couldn't accommodate their congregations now contain more space than worshippers. The very air seems different. Cleaner perhaps, with fewer bodies producing waste and fewer industries polluting, but heavy with the silence of the missing. Villages and towns have contracted like drying leather, pulling inward as populations dwindle. Entire neighborhoods stand abandoned, their buildings slowly collapsing from neglect. In some places, authorities consolidate survivors in central areas, leaving outlying districts to crumble back into the landscape. The physical geography of your world has changed, with human presence retreating from areas it once dominated. But the most profound changes aren't physical, they're social and economic. The massive population reduction has completely upended the labour market, creating opportunities unimaginable before the plague. If you're a peasant or urban worker who survived, you've suddenly become a valuable commodity rather than an easily replaced cog. Employers compete for your services, offering higher wages, better conditions, and unprecedented mobility. This new leverage manifests in concrete improvements to your daily life. Your diet improves as you can afford better food. Your housing conditions upgrade as you can demand more space and comfort. Your working hours might decrease as you negotiate more favourable terms. For the first time in generations, the balance of power has shifted away from landowners and toward labourers. The ruling classes don't surrender their advantages without a fight, of course. Legislation attempts to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and restrict worker movement. The Statute of Labourers in England and similar laws across Europe try to maintain the old economic order through legal force. But these efforts largely fail against the fundamental reality of demographic change. There simply aren't enough workers to maintain pre-plague production under pre-plague conditions. If you're among the more entrepreneurial survivors, unprecedented opportunities await. Property lies unclaimed or undervalued. Trades and businesses have lost their practitioners, creating gaps you might fill with minimal competition. Guilds, which previously restricted entry to protect their members' interests, now desperately recruit new blood to maintain their existence. Apprenticeships that once required significant payments or connections become readily available to anyone showing aptitude. Social mobility accelerates in this environment. Peasants become landowners, craftspeople become merchants, merchants become minor nobility. The rigid class structure hasn't disappeared, but its boundaries have become more permeable than at any time in recent memory. Your children might occupy social positions that would have been completely inaccessible to them in the pre-plague world. Marriage patterns shift dramatically in your favour, regardless of gender. With so many dead, the marriage market has fewer participants and different dynamics. Widows and widowers, suddenly single again, represent marriage opportunities that bring established households and resources. Young people, seeing the fragility of life, marry earlier and start families sooner. age gaps between spouses often increase as older survivors seek younger partners to rebuild families decimated by disease. If you're a woman who survived, you might find unexpected economic opportunities. The shortage of male workers opens previously restricted occupations to female participation. Women enter trades, manage businesses, and take on roles previously considered exclusively masculine. While full gender equality remains centuries away, the post-plague period represents a significant, if temporary, expansion of women's economic activity and independence. Religious practices evolve in response to the collective trauma you've experienced. Some communities become more devout, interpreting survival as divine favor that demands pious gratitude. Others grow more skeptical of religious authority, questioning a church that failed to protect or explain the calamity. New religious movements emerge, some orthodox, others heretical, all attempting to make theological sense of the mass death you've witnessed. Your psychological outlook likely bears the permanent imprint of survival. You might experience what modern psychologists would call survivor's guilt, the nagging question of why you lived when so many others died. This manifests in various ways: religious devotion, risk-taking behavior, obsessive work, or a driving need to create meaning from your continued existence. The plague becomes the dividing line in your personal narrative. Everything is before or after, with your identity permanently shaped by having endured what others didn't. Your relationship with death itself has fundamentally changed. Having witnessed mortality on an industrial scale, you likely view death with a familiarity that future generations will find morbid. Memento mori, remember that you will die, becomes less a philosophical concept and more a daily reality. This awareness might lead to greater appreciation for life's pleasures, religious contemplation, or a pragmatic approach to mortality that seems callous to those who haven't shared your experience. The cultural and artistic landscape reflects these psychological changes. The danse macabre, or dance of death, becomes a common artistic motif, depicting people of all social classes dancing with personified death, a reminder of mortality's universality that resonates with your lived experience. Literature explores themes of divine justice, human suffering, and the apparent randomness of survival or death. Music, architecture, and visual arts all bear the imprint of collective trauma and tentative renewal. Political power shifts in ways that create both opportunities and instabilities. Noble families decimated by plague need to be replaced or supplemented with new blood. Traditional power centers weakened by population loss may find themselves challenged by previously marginal groups. Peasant revolts become more common and sometimes more successful as workers leverage their new economic power into political demands. The Jacquerie in France and the English peasants' revolt, while ultimately suppressed, demonstrate the new willingness of common people to challenge authority. If you're among the educated elite who survived, your skills have become even more valuable. The plague killed indiscriminately across social classes, creating shortages of literate administrators, legal experts, and other specialized knowledge workers. Universities, having lost students and faculty, actively recruit new scholars. The transmission of knowledge, interrupted by mass death, requires conscious effort to maintain, creating opportunities for those with education or the capacity to acquire it. Technological innovation accelerates in some areas as labor shortages drive the need for efficiency. Labor-saving devices receive more attention and investment. Agricultural practices evolve to require fewer workers. Construction techniques simplify to accommodate less skilled labor. These adaptations, born of necessity, contribute to long-term productivity improvements that outlast the immediate post-plague period. Your daily life includes constant reminders of what was lost, empty houses in your community, abandoned fields returning to wilderness, tools and possessions of the dead repurposed for new owners, names no longer spoken because entire families perished, leaving no one to remember them. These absences form the negative space around your survival, shaping your experience of the post-plague world as profoundly as the positive changes in your economic and social position. If you've survived with your family intact, an unlikely but possible scenario, you might find yourselves unexpected heirs to property or opportunities from more distant relatives who perished without direct descendants. Family structures contract and expand simultaneously, with nuclear families becoming more important as extended kinship networks are decimated, while simultaneously absorbing orphaned relatives from branches that couldn't survive intact. The plague you've survived will eventually return. This isn't a one-time event, but the beginning of a pattern that will continue for centuries. Future outbreaks might be less devastating than the initial Black Death, but they will occur regularly enough to become an expected feature of European life. Your children and grandchildren will grow up in a world where plague is a known threat, recurring every few decades to remind humanity of its vulnerability. But between these recurrences, life continues with a resilience that might surprise you. Communities rebuild, populations slowly increase, trade resumes and expands. The fundamental human capacity for adaptation asserts itself, finding new patterns of existence in the altered landscape of post-plague Europe. You participate in this renewal, contributing your labour, your skills, your genetic legacy to the reconstruction of a society forever changed by what it has endured. And perhaps, in quiet moments, you reflect on your improbable survival. Was it random chance? Divine intervention? Some quirk of your constitution or circumstance? You'll never know for certain. But in a world where death claimed so many, your continued existence represents something precious, a second chance, an opportunity to build something new from the ashes of catastrophe, a living bridge between what was lost and what might yet be created. Because in post-plague Europe, survival isn't just biological continuity. It's the chance to participate in the painful, halting rebirth of a civilization that will never be the same again. Conclusion. We've journeyed together through the darkest chapter of medieval history, exploring every grim facet of life and death during the Black Plague. From the moment you awakened on your bug-infested mattress to your final fevered breaths or improbable survival, we've seen how utterly unprepared your modern sensibilities would be for the brutal reality of 14th century pandemic living. The Black Death wasn't just another historical event, a footnote in dusty textbooks or a macabre curiosity. It was a biological cataclysm that reshaped European society at every level, from intimate family structures to continental economic systems. It killed with democratic indifference, claiming peasants and nobles, sinners and saints, the young and old alike. No one was truly safe, and everyone knew it. This awareness of universal vulnerability created a unique psychological landscape, a collective trauma experienced across an entire continent, processed through the limited understanding and coping mechanisms available to medieval minds. Without modern science to explain disease transmission, without modern medicine to offer effective treatment, without modern communication to coordinate responses, medieval Europeans faced the plague with nothing but their faith, their folk wisdom, and their fundamental human resilience. When we compare our modern pandemic responses to those of our medieval ancestors, the differences are stark and humbling. We track infection rates with sophisticated surveillance systems. They counted corpses in streets. We developed vaccines in laboratories. They carried posies of herbs and prayed to saints. We implement evidence-based public health measures. They blamed minority groups and flagellated themselves in public squares. Yet beneath these differences lie surprising similarities. The human impulses to seek explanation, to assign blame, to protect loved ones, to find meaning in suffering, these transcend time and technology. The social tensions between individual freedom and collective safety, between economic activity and disease prevention, between scientific understanding and religious interpretation, these too have echoed across centuries of pandemic response. Perhaps the most profound lesson from the Black Death is the reminder of our persistent vulnerability despite technological advancement. For all our modern medicine and digital connectivity, we remain biological organisms susceptible to novel pathogens. The medieval person dying of plague and the modern person dying of an emerging disease share a fundamental human experience that bridges the centuries between them. But there's hope in this comparison too. Medieval Europe eventually recovered from the Black Death, though forever changed by its passage. Populations rebounded, cities rebuilt, trade resumed. Art and culture flourished, sometimes directly inspired by the experience of mass mortality. Human creativity and adaptability asserted themselves against the backdrop of unprecedented loss. This resilience offers perspective on our own challenges. If medieval societies could recover from losing a third of their population with nothing but their bare hands and limited understanding, perhaps our own crises, managed with vastly superior resources and knowledge, aren't quite as insurmountable as they sometimes appear. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps you'll reflect on how fortunate you are to live in an age of antibiotics and indoor plumbing, of germ theory and vaccine development, of pain management and palliative care. The medieval world we've explored together exists now only in history and imagination, a reminder of both human vulnerability and human endurance. So rest easy in your clean, bug-free bed, secure in the knowledge that if you wake tomorrow with a swollen lymph node, you can seek treatment rather than last rites. The plague that once reshaped civilization now yields to a simple course of antibiotics, a transformation that would seem nothing short of miraculous to the medieval minds we've inhabited on our journey. And if you find yourself complaining about minor inconveniences of modern life, a slow internet connection, a delayed flight, a favorite restaurant being out of avocado toast, perhaps you'll pause and remember, at least no one's throwing buckets of human waste out their window onto your head. At least your teeth aren't rotting while a barber surgeon stands by with rusty pliers. At least your plague doctor isn't prescribing powdered mummy and mercury as treatment, because the truth is, you wouldn't last a day during the Black Plague. None of us would, and that's precisely why we should appreciate the world we have, built upon the suffering and survival of countless generations who endured what we can barely imagine. Sleep well, knowing that the medieval nightmare we've explored together remains safely in the past, a dark chapter of human history that we can study from the comfortable distance of centuries, grateful for the progress that separates us from its horrors. Good night and pleasant dreams, free from buboes, bloodletting, and the constant tolling of funeral bells.